The phone rang once in a cold stone room in Verdun, and the outcome of the largest battle the United States would ever fight in Western Europe came down to what one man said into it. It was December 19th, 1944. Outside, the snow had been falling for days. Inside, the most powerful commanders of the American Army sat around a table with a single map spread out in front of them, and on that map was a disaster none of them had seen coming. 3 days earlier, the ground had opened up beneath the entire Allied front. The Germans had done the one thing nobody at Supreme Headquarters believed they were still capable of doing. They had attacked. Not a raid, not a probe, not a desperate little counterpunch. A full offensive. Sudden, massive, and aimed straight through the thinnest, quietest stretch of the American line in the forests of the Ardennes. The man carrying the weight of all of it was Dwight Eisenhower. He had not slept properly in days. He was the supreme Allied commander in Europe, the person every soldier on that front answered to in the end, and he had just watched a hole get torn through his army wide enough to swallow whole divisions. Somewhere inside that hole, cut off, freezing, and running out of everything, were 20,000 American men. If they died on his orders. If they were captured, that was his failure too. And on the morning of December 19th, most of the professionals in that room quietly believed there was very little anyone could do to save them in time. To understand how it got that bad, you have to go back 3 days, to the morning it all began, December 16th, 1944, before dawn. Along an 80-mile stretch of the Ardennes, the sky lit up. Nearly 2,000 German guns opened fire at the same moment, and the barrage rolled across the American positions like a wall of thunder. Then, out of the fog and the tree line came the infantry, and behind them the tanks. Hitler had gathered a force the Allies did not think he had left in him. Around 250,000 German soldiers. Hundreds of tanks, including the heavy Tiger and Panther machines that American crews had learned to fear. Thousands of vehicles, all of it thrown at a single objective that the ordinary soldier in the line had no idea about. The objective was Antwerp. That name matters more than anything else in this story, so hold on to it. Antwerp was a port, far to the northwest, and by the winter of 1944, it had become the beating heart of the entire Allied war effort in the West. Almost everything the American and British armies needed came through it. Fuel for the tanks, shells for the guns, food, boots, bandages, replacement men. The plan Hitler signed off on was simple to say and terrifying to imagine. Punch through the weak American center, race across the River Meuse, and drive all the way to Antwerp before the Allies could react. If it worked, the British armies in the north would be cut off from the American armies in the south. Two halves of a broken front, unable to reach each other, unable to be supplied. Hitler believed that kind of shock might force the Western Allies to the negotiating table and buy Germany the time it desperately needed. And for the first few days, it looked like it might actually happen. The Germans had chosen their spot with real cunning. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, a place where tired divisions were sent to rest and green divisions were sent to learn. Some of the American units in the path of the attack had never seen serious combat. Others had been chewed up in earlier fighting and were licking their wounds. They were spread thin across rough, wooded country, and when the storm hit them, many were simply overwhelmed before they understood what was happening. Command posts were overrun. Radio lines went dead. Whole companies found themselves surrounded in the dark, fighting on with no clear picture of where the enemy was or how far the line behind them had collapsed. Then there was the weather, and the weather was on Germany's side. Thick, low clouds sat over the whole region like a lid. Fog filled the valleys. Snow came down hard, and that meant the one advantage the Allies counted on above all others was taken away from them. Air power. American and British aircraft ruled the skies over Europe by this point in the war, and German commanders had learned to move only at night to avoid them. But you cannot fly through cloud you cannot see through. Day after day, the planes stayed on the ground while the German columns rolled forward under a gray ceiling, untouched. Hitler had timed his attack for the worst flying weather of the winter on purpose. It worked exactly as he hoped. The confusion in those first days went deeper than just broken radios and overrun command posts. The Germans had slipped teams of English-speaking soldiers, dressed in captured American uniforms and driving captured American vehicles, in behind the lines. Their job was to sow chaos. They switched road signs, cut telephone wires, spread false orders, and turned columns of retreating men down the wrong roads. It worked far beyond its small numbers, because once word got out that the enemy might be wearing your own uniform, nobody trusted anybody. American soldiers began stopping each other at checkpoints and demanding answers to questions only a real American would know. About baseball, about hometowns, about film stars, and men were held at gunpoint by their own side over a wrong answer. Even senior officers were pulled over and grilled. The whole front caught a kind of paranoia, and paranoia costs time, and time was the one thing the trapped men in the days ahead would not have to spare. As the German spearheads pushed west, one small town started to matter far more than its size suggested. It was called Bastogne. On a map it looked like nothing, a quiet Belgian town of a few thousand people. But 7 roads met there. 7. In country like the Ardennes, where the forests were dense and the good roads were few, a road hub like that was worth more than gold. The German tanks needed those roads. Tanks are hungry, thirsty machines, and they cannot simply crash cross-country through deep snow and thick forest for very long. To keep the offensive moving toward the Meuse and beyond, the Germans needed to take Bastogne and use its roads. And the Americans, once they understood that, decided Bastogne had to be held no matter the cost. The trouble was there was almost nobody there to hold it. What happened next became one of the most famous races of the entire war. As the crisis became clear, Eisenhower released his reserve. The 101st Airborne Division, the paratroopers, were resting far behind the lines after brutal fighting in Holland. Many were missing weapons, winter clothing, and equipment. They were loaded onto open trucks in the freezing dark and driven flat out toward Bastogne, passing streams of shattered, retreating American soldiers going the other way. Some of the paratroopers grabbed rifles and ammunition off men who were pulling back because they had none of their own. Alongside them came a piece of an armored division, the 10th, sent to buy time on the approaches. They got there first, barely, and they threw themselves in front of the German advance at little crossroads villages outside the town, dying in 1s and 2s to slow the tanks down by hours. Those hours let the paratroopers dig in, and then the ring closed. By December 20th and into the 21st, the German advance had flowed around Bastogne on both sides and sealed it off completely. The town was surrounded, cut off, an island of American troops in a sea of German armor, with no road out and no way in. Inside were the paratroopers of the 101st, the armored men who had joined them, engineers, artillerymen, medics, stragglers from a dozen broken units who had fallen back into the town and picked up a rifle. Around 20,000 men in all. They had limited ammunition, limited fuel. Medical supplies were running low almost immediately, and there was no way to evacuate the wounded, who filled the cellars of the town. The temperature dropped far below freezing and stayed there. Men without proper winter gear stood in foxholes filled with snow, and the frostbite cases climbed as fast as the combat casualties. And still the planes could not fly to help them, because the fog would not lift, and the men doing the surrounding were not amateurs. Pressing in on Bastogne were units of the German 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of the sharpest armored commanders Germany had left. Manteuffel did not particularly want to get bogged down at Bastogne at all. His orders were to bypass strong points where he could and keep racing west toward the Meuse, because he understood better than almost anyone that his whole part in the offensive lived or died on speed. But those 7 roads pulled at him. He could not simply leave a fortified American garrison sitting on the crossroads behind his advance, threatening his supply and his flank. So he peeled off forces to reduce the town, expecting it to fall in short order the way surrounded positions usually did, and then he could get back to the race. Every day it did not fall was a day his timetable slipped, and he knew it. And the pressure he put on that perimeter grew heavier because of it. That pressure was constant. The Germans probed the perimeter day and night, looking for the soft spot, shelling the town, sending tanks and infantry against one sector and then another to find where the thin American line might finally crack. Inside the town, the defenders had to be everywhere at once with a force that was never big enough. They shifted their few tanks and tank destroyers from one threatened point to the next, like a man trying to plug a leaking boat with too few hands. The artillery inside Bastogne was so short of shells that at times gunners were told to fire only at the most important targets and to make every round count. In the cellars, the wounded lay on straw with too little morphine and too few doctors, and every night the cold took men that the fighting had missed. This was the situation that landed on Eisenhower's table. The professionals looked at it and saw an army in a trap. So on December 19th, Eisenhower called his senior commanders together in Verdun to decide what could be done. The room was cold. There was one small stove that barely touched the chill. The men came in stamping snow off their boots, tired, grim, some of them shaken. The mood was heavy, and Eisenhower, to his enormous credit, refused to let it stay that way. He is supposed to have looked around at the worried faces and said that the present situation should be regarded not as a disaster, but as an opportunity, and that there should only be cheerful faces at that table. It was the kind of thing a leader says to steady his people. But everyone in the room understood the arithmetic. 20,000 men were trapped, they were running out of everything, and getting to them looked close to impossible. Why impossible? Look at where the nearest large force capable of a rescue actually was. The army that could do it belonged to a man named George Patton. Patton's Third Army was fighting hard, but it was fighting in the wrong direction. His divisions were far to the south, pushing east, deep into their own offensive, with all their supply lines, fuel dumps, and momentum committed that way. To rescue Bastogne, Patton would have to do something that on paper sounds almost insane. He would have to stop an entire army that was in the middle of a fight, turn it roughly 90 degrees, and drive it north through the worst winter in memory over narrow, icy, half-broken roads, then attack a battle-hardened enemy at the far end. And he would have to do it fast enough to matter, before the men in Bastogne ran out of ammunition and were overrun. Everyone in that room had spent their careers studying exactly this kind of maneuver. Moving a large army is not like moving a single unit. It is tens of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, fuel convoys, artillery, ammunition trains, field kitchens, medical units, engineers, all of which have to travel in the right order on roads that can only carry so much traffic at once. Turning that machine sideways in winter, in a hurry, without it tangling into a hopeless traffic jam 100 miles long, was the sort of thing that got talked about in staff colleges as a nightmare to be avoided. The honest answer to how long it would take was measured in days. Many days. A week, maybe more. And Bastogne might not have a week. So Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked the question that everything hung on. How soon could he attack north toward Bastogne, and with what? This is the moment your video is really about. Because of what Patton said, and because of what it meant. Patton did not give a careful answer full of conditions. He did not ask for a week to study the roads. He looked at Eisenhower and he said 4 words. I can reach them. The room went quiet. Not because it was a boast. Boasts were something these men had heard from Patton plenty of times, and they usually knew how to weigh them. This was quiet, and that was what unsettled them. He said it the way a man states a simple fact he has already checked. Then he told them the timeline that turned the quiet into shock. He could attack in the direction of Bastogne, he said, in a matter of days, with 3 divisions, and he named a date so close that several officers in the room did not believe it was serious. Some thought he had misjudged the distances. Others thought he was doing what Patton always did, promising the impossible to look bold in front of the Supreme Commander. There were doubtful looks around that table, and a few of the staff officers were certain it could not be done. They were wrong, and there was a reason they were wrong, and the reason is the part most people never hear. Patton had already started. He had not walked into that meeting to think about the problem. He had walked in having already solved most of it in advance. In the days before the conference, while the crisis was still unfolding, Patton had gone back to his own headquarters, gathered his staff, and told them to prepare not one plan but several, each one covering a different direction the army might be ordered to move. He had them work out the routes, the road priorities, the fuel, the order of march, everything, for a turn to the north that at that point nobody had officially asked him to make. He had a hunch about where this was going, and instead of waiting to be told, he did the work early. So while the other commanders at Verdun were still absorbing the shock of the question, Patton already had the answer sitting in a folder back at his headquarters, ready to go. That is why the 4 words were not bravado. When Patton said he could reach them, he was not guessing. He had the plan. All he needed was permission and a signal. And here is where the phone comes back into it. Before Patton had left for Verdun, he had arranged something clever with his staff. He gave them a set of code words. Each code word matched one of the plans they had prepared. He told them that if he called and said a certain word, they were to launch a certain movement immediately, without waiting for the paperwork to catch up. That way, the moment he committed in the meeting, the machine could start turning within minutes, not hours. So when Eisenhower approved the attack, Patton did not sit back and let the orders grind slowly down the chain of command. He got up, went to a telephone, called his headquarters, and gave the code word. That single phone call set an entire army in motion. Think about what that actually looked like on the ground. Across the frozen countryside, in dozens of villages and field camps, radios crackled and orders came down. Units that had been pointing east began to swing north. Convoys formed up in the dark. Tank engines that had been left running to keep from freezing were revved and put in gear. Fuel trucks were routed to new roads. Military police fanned out to the crossroads to keep the traffic flowing and stop the whole thing from seizing up. What the staff colleges had called impossible was already beginning, because one man had done his thinking early and one phone call had turned that thinking into movement. Now, about Eisenhower. There is a reason your title puts him at the center of the emotion, and it is not just for the clique. Put yourself in his position that day. He was the man who would be blamed for everything. If Bastogne fell, if 20,000 Americans were marched into captivity in the snow, the newspapers back home would carry that failure with his name on it, and he knew it. He had been up for days. He was surrounded by careful men giving him careful answers about how this could not be fixed quickly. And then Patton, of all people, the difficult one, the one Eisenhower had been forced to discipline and defend more than once, looked him in the eye and told him plainly that he could reach the trapped men, and gave a date so close it barely seemed real. What broke through to Eisenhower was not the tactics. It was the relief. For days the answer to every question had been a version of no. Not yet. Not possible. Too slow. And here at last was a man saying yes, and meaning it, and already moving to prove it. When you are carrying the lives of 20,000 men, and you have heard nothing but reasons it cannot be done, the moment somebody finally says it can be, something gives way in you. Whatever you want to call it, that is the moment the mood in the room changed. The heaviness lifted. The impossible became a plan with a date on it. And the man who had been bracing himself to explain a catastrophe suddenly had a chance, a real chance, to save those men instead. That is the phone call. That is the 4 words. Everything after it was blood, cold, and effort. The turn itself was one of the most remarkable feats of the war, and it gets far less attention than it deserves. Over the days that followed, Patton's Third Army executed a pivot that logistics experts still study. More than 100,000 men changed direction. Whole divisions that had been driving one way were pulled out of the line, wheeled north, and pushed toward Bastogne over roads that were never meant to carry that kind of traffic in that kind of weather. The Sherman tanks rolled north. the tank destroyers rolled north. The self-propelled guns, the trucks, the ambulances, the endless fuel convoys, all of it flowed up toward the fighting. None of it was smooth. The roads were sheets of ice. Bridges had been damaged or blown. In places, the columns crawled forward at walking pace, then stopped dead for hours in traffic jams that stretched for miles while the men stamped their feet and cursed the cold. Drivers went for a day and a night without real sleep, hands frozen to the wheel, headlights taped down to slits so the enemy could not spot them. Vehicles slid off the road and had to be hauled back on. And through all of it, the columns kept moving, because they knew, or at least the officers knew, that somewhere ahead of them, men were dying in the snow and counting the hours until help arrived. Meanwhile, inside Bastogne, the men were holding on by their fingernails, and one moment from those days became legend. On December 22nd, 4 German officers walked toward the American lines under a white flag. They carried a written message for the commander of the surrounded town. It was a demand to surrender. It laid out, in polite and reasonable language, that the town was cut off, that there was no hope of rescue, and that the honorable thing for the Americans to do was to give up and avoid pointless slaughter. The message reached the acting commander of the defenders, a general named Anthony McAuliffe. He read it, and his reaction, the reply he sent back to the German commander in writing, was a single word: nuts. The Germans who received it were genuinely confused. It did not translate. They had to ask what it meant. An American officer explained that it meant, roughly, go to hell. That reply, that one absurd, defiant word, went around the world. It told everyone exactly what kind of men were holding Bastogne. They were freezing, they were low on shells, they were surrounded, and they were not going anywhere. They just needed someone to reach them before the ammunition ran out. Patton's army was that someone, and it was coming as fast as frozen roads would allow. There is a strange, almost unbelievable little story from these days that happens to be true, and it tells you everything about how much the weather was tormenting the men trying to save Bastogne. Patton, growing desperate at the fog that kept his air support grounded, actually ordered one of his chaplains to write a prayer. Not a private prayer whispered to himself. A prayer for good weather, to be printed and handed out to the whole army. The chaplain, a man named James O'Neill, was a little startled by the request, but he wrote it. It asked God to restrain the rains and the mud that had opposed them, and to grant fair weather for battle. Patton had it printed on thousands of little cards and distributed to his soldiers. He was a hard, profane man who cursed like a sailor, and here he was ordering his army to pray for a break in the clouds because he could not fight the way he needed to without the sky. Then, on December 23rd, the sky did the one thing everyone had been praying for. It cleared. Patton, so the story goes, was delighted and joked that his chaplain had earned a medal for the fine weather. You can believe as much of the divine part of that as you like. What is not in doubt is that after days of gray, the clouds pulled back exactly when the Allies needed them to, and an air force that had been locked out of the war came flooding back into it. After days of gray ceiling and fog, the weather finally broke, and the Allied air forces came roaring back into a war they had been locked out of. Fighter bombers swept over the German columns that had been moving in safety for a week, and the safety was gone. They hit tanks, trucks, and troops caught in the open on the snow. At the same time, transport planes came in over Bastogne and dropped bundles by parachute into the perimeter. Ammunition, medical supplies, and food came drifting down out of a clear sky to men who had almost run out of all three. For the defenders, watching those parachutes open overhead was like watching the world remember they existed. Men who had been rationing their last clips of ammunition ran out into open ground under fire to drag the bundles back, because a bundle that landed in no man's land was no use to anyone. Some of the drops drifted into German hands, and the men watched them go with a bitterness that is hard to describe, having counted on supplies they then saw fall to the enemy. But enough came down inside the perimeter to matter. Gunners who had been told to hoard every shell suddenly had rounds to fire. Medics who had been out of the basics got bandages and morphine. It did not end the siege, and the shelling did not stop, and the cold did not lift. But something had changed in the feeling of the place. The tide had not turned yet, but for the first time the wind was at their backs, and still the men held. That is the part worth sitting with for a moment. They did not know on December 23rd that relief was only days away. For all they knew, the corridor might never open, the drops might be the last help they ever got, and the next big German push might be the one that finally broke them. They held anyway. Cold, hungry, low on everything, surrounded, and they held anyway, because the alternative was letting the road hub fall and handing the enemy exactly what he needed. Every hour they bought with their stubbornness was an hour Patton's army used to close the distance, and the relief force kept grinding north. Leading the way was the 4th Armored Division. Its tanks fought forward village by village, road by road, against German units determined to keep the corridor shut. This was not a parade. Every mile was contested. The Germans understood as well as the Americans did what it would mean if that armored column reached the town, and they threw everything they had into stopping it. There were sharp, ugly little battles at crossroads and in shattered farm hamlets, tanks burning on the snow, infantry fighting from ditch to ditch in temperatures that could kill a wounded man before anyone reached him. At the tip of that column was a young tank battalion commander who would become one of the most famous soldiers in American history long after the war, a man named Creighton Abrams. On the afternoon of the breakthrough, with the town almost in reach, he made the kind of call Patton would have loved. Instead of waiting to gather more strength for a careful, methodical assault, he decided to gamble everything on a straight, hard drive through the last German positions, betting that speed and surprise would carry his tanks through before the enemy could react. He gave the order, the tanks lunged forward, and they smashed their way up the final stretch of road toward the American lines. Then, on December 26, 1944, it happened. A column from the 4th Armored punched through the last German position blocking the southern approach and rolled into Bastogne. When the lead tank reached the perimeter, a paratrooper of the 101st came out to meet it, and the two men from the two halves of the story, the one who had held and the one who had broken through, shook hands in the snow. The corridor was open. The ring was broken. The link-up between the relief force and the defenders was made, and the 20,000 men who had been alone in the snow for the better part of a week were alone no longer. A road out existed. Supplies and reinforcements could pour in, and the wounded who had been packed into cellars could finally start coming out. The trap that Hitler had sprung on Bastogne had failed. It would be a lie to say the battle was over, because it was not. The fighting in the Ardennes ground on for weeks after that, savage and cold, as the Germans tried and failed to close the corridor again, and the Americans slowly pushed the whole bulge back to where it started. But the moment the corridor opened on December 26th, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Bastogne held. The road hub stayed in American hands, and the German timetable, which depended on speed above all else, was wrecked. Now let me tell you why all of this mattered so much, because it is easy to look at one small Belgian town and miss the size of what was actually at stake. Go back to that word from the beginning. Antwerp. The whole German gamble depended on reaching it fast. The plan was built on a knife edge of timing. The German columns had a limited amount of fuel, a limited number of days of surprise, and a limited window of bad weather to hide under. Every hour they were held up somewhere they had not planned to be was an hour bleeding out of a plan that had no margin for delay. Bastogne, sitting on its 7 roads, was exactly the kind of place they could not afford to get stuck at. When the paratroopers held it, and then Patton's army broke through to keep it held, the German advance lost the roads it needed and the time it did not have. And what was on the other side of that delay was enormous. If the Germans had taken Bastogne quickly, used its roads, and driven on toward the Meuse and beyond, they would have been aiming at the supply lifeline of the entire Western Front. Antwerp handled the overwhelming majority of the fuel and shells and food that the American and British armies ran on. Threaten that, or worse, split the Allied armies in two so the British in the north could not link with the Americans in the south, and you do not just lose a battle. You lose the ability to fight the way you have been fighting. Fuel dries up. Guns fall silent for lack of shells. Advances grind to a halt, not because men are beaten, but because nothing can reach them. That was the collapse Hitler was reaching for. There was a political side to Hitler's gamble too, and it is worth understanding, because it was really the whole point. He did not truly expect to conquer the Western Allies with this attack. What he wanted was to hurt them so badly and so suddenly that the alliance itself might crack. Split the British and Americans apart on the map, inflict a humiliating defeat, and maybe, he hoped, the strain between the Allied governments and generals would do the rest. Maybe they would start to distrust each other. Maybe they would lose their appetite for the war in the West and look for terms, which would free Germany to throw everything it had at the Soviets in the East. The offensive was as much a blow aimed at Allied unity and nerve as it was at Allied territory. And a quick, clean victory at a place like Bastogne, followed by a dash to the Meuse, was exactly the kind of shock that might have started that unraveling. None of it happened. And a large part of the reason is that the German machine got stuck in the snow around a town it needed and could not take, while an American army that was supposed to be a week away arrived in days. Let me be honest about the human cost of the alternative, because it is easy to talk about supply lines and forget what they mean. If Bastogne had fallen and the German plan had gained real momentum, the war in the West would very likely have dragged on longer than it did. And in this war, longer did not mean a few extra headlines. It meant more men dead on both sides, more towns flattened, more months of the camps in the East still running, more of everything terrible that every extra week of that war produced. 20,000 men trapped in Bastogne were the immediate stakes. The longer shadow behind them was measured in numbers almost too large to hold in your head. That is what one phone call and 4 words helped hold back. So what do we make of Patton himself, the man at the center of it? He was not a simple hero, and it does him no favors to pretend he was. Patton was hard, arrogant, and difficult to work with. He had a temper that got him into serious trouble. Not long before all this, he had struck 2 soldiers suffering from combat exhaustion in hospital tents, and the scandal nearly ended his career. He was crude. He collected enemies. Plenty of officers who served near him found him exhausting to be around, and Eisenhower had spent real political capital keeping him in the war at all. If you were building a list of the most agreeable, most reliable, most steady commanders in the American Army, George Patton's name would not be near the top. But December 1944 did not call for the most agreeable man. It called for the one commander who had already done the impossible in his head before anyone asked him to do it on the ground. It called for someone who thought in terms of speed when everyone else was thinking in terms of caution, who prepared 3 plans before there was even a question, and who could turn an army in the snow and mean it when he said he would reach the trapped men. In peacetime, Patton's worst qualities got him into trouble. In that one winter crisis, the very restlessness and aggression that made him hard to handle turned out to be exactly what 20,000 men needed. Here is the thing I keep coming back to, and it is not really about tanks or roads at all. It is about timing, and about the willingness to move before you are certain. Almost every other commander in that room gave a reasonable answer, and their reasonable answers all pointed at a week or more, which for the men in Bastogne might have been the same as forever. Patton gave an unreasonable answer, and his unreasonable answer was right, because he had quietly done the unreasonable work ahead of time. He did not wait for perfect information. He did not wait for the situation to fully clarify before he started planning. He read where things were going, committed early, and had a signal ready so that the instant permission came, the whole machine could move. By the time everyone else was ready to begin thinking, he was already ready to attack. That is the lesson buried under the snow and the tank tracks. In a real crisis, the person who acts a day early can save what the person who acts a day late cannot. Patton understood that in his bones. He believed that in war, hesitation kills more men than any wrong decision made quickly. He would rather move now and fix the details in motion than wait for a plan so perfect it arrived after the men were already dead. And in the worst week of the winter of 1944, that instinct is a very large part of why Bastogne held, and why so many men who should have died in the snow lived to go home. So when you hear the story boiled down to a title, one phone call, 4 words, remember that behind those 4 words was an army, a plan built in advance, a set of code words waiting by a telephone, 20,000 freezing men, and a decision that could have ended a career instead of saving a battle. Remember Eisenhower, worn down and bracing for catastrophe, hearing a difficult man tell him the thing he most needed to hear. Remember the drivers frozen to their wheels, the tanks fighting village by village, the parachutes opening over a starving town, and one word of pure defiance sent back to an enemy who thought the answer was obvious. History likes to remember battles as numbers, divisions and tanks and kilometers on a map. But sometimes the whole thing pivots on something much smaller than that. A hunch acted on early. A folder of plans nobody asked for. A code word spoken into a telephone in a cold room. 4 quiet words that turned a room full of no into a plan full of yes. Bastogne could have been one of the darkest single chapters of the American War. Instead, an army turned north in the snow, one commander chose speed over caution, and one phone call became part of history. I want to hear from you on this one, so tell me in the comments. Do you think any other commander in that room could have made the same call? Could have turned an entire army in days and meant it? Could have looked Eisenhower in the eye and said he would reach them? Put the name down if you have one, because I would honestly like to know who you would trust with those 20,000 lives. And if someone in your family lived through that winter, if a grandfather or a great-uncle stood in one of those frozen foxholes, or drove one of those trucks north through the ice, or watched those parachutes come down over Bastogne, tell their story here. Write down what you know. History is not only what gets printed in the thick books on the shelf. It lives in the memory of the people who were there, and in the stories they passed down. And every time you write one of those stories in the comments, you keep a little of it alive for the rest of us. Thank you for watching. If this brought that winter a little closer for you, stay with the channel, because there are more of these stories to tell, and every one of them turned on people who were braver, or faster, or more stubborn than anyone had a right to expect. Until the next one, take care of yourself, and remember the men who did not come back from the snow.